What if the heir to a billionaire empire traded luxury for simplicity, hiding his identity to search for true love? At Magnolia House, secrets unravel, hearts collide, and a villain lurks in the shadows. Will love conquer deception, or will the past destroy their future? Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Graham Rutherford stepped off the bus onto the cracked pavement of the Charleston station. The evening air clung to his skin, warm and thick, carrying with it the faint tang of salt water and the earthy perfume of blooming magnolias. His fingers tightened around the strap of his scuffed leather satchel, the only piece of his past life he had allowed himself to keep. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him of what he had left behind. And why. Charleston felt alive in a way New York never had. The city hummed with the soft cadence of a slower pace. The occasional clatter of footsteps over cobblestones, the distant murmur of laughter spilling from open doorways, and the rhythmic chirping of cicadas hidden in the shadows. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating grandeur of Manhattan boardrooms and charity galas, where his name, Rutherford, was both a golden ticket and an iron cage. Here he wasn't Graham Rutherford, heir to a billion-dollar fortune. Here he was just Grant Hale, a man seeking freedom from a life that had demanded too much and given too little in return. Ahead, Magnolia House loomed like a sentinel of history. The estate was both imposing and inviting, its ivy-draped walls and sprawling gardens whispering stories of lives lived and long since passed. Graham, or rather Grant, drew a steadying breath. This would be his sanctuary, a place to shed the weight of expectations and rediscover who he was. Inside the main hall, the air was cool, tinged with the faint aroma of lavender polish and aged wood. A woman stood behind the desk, her silver-framed glasses perched precariously on the edge of her nose. She regarded him with a mix of brisk politeness and curiosity. "Grant Hale?" she asked, scanning a clipboard. "That's me," he replied, adjusting the strap of his bag as his voice adopted the easy confidence he hoped would sell his carefully constructed persona. She nodded, pushing a form toward him. "Sign here. You'll be reporting to Miss Clara Evans. She oversees all preservation efforts on the property. You're expected to assist with garden maintenance and any restoration work she requires." Graham scrawled his name on the dotted line, the act feeling foreign yet oddly liberating. His handwriting, purposefully altered to reflect his new identity, was shaky but legible. "You'll find her in the East Wing Library," the woman added. "Miss Evans is particular, but you'll get used to it." He nodded, offering a polite smile before heading down the corridor. Each step echoed against the polished wooden floors, the distant smell of old books growing stronger with every turn. The library was dimly lit, its towering shelves filled with an eclectic array of leather-bound volumes and antique artifacts. At the far end of the room, a woman stood hunched over a table, her auburn hair falling loosely from a hastily pinned bun. She was so engrossed in the manuscript before her that she didn't notice his approach. "Miss Evans?" he said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. She looked up, her hazel eyes sharp and assessing. For a moment she studied him, her expression unreadable, before softening into polite professionalism. "Grant Hale?" she asked, straightening. "The new groundskeeper?" "That's right." He held her gaze, keeping his voice steady. Clara Evans nodded once, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You're early, but that's fine. Follow me. The gardens need attention, and there's an event this weekend that requires preparation." Grant trailed her out of the library, the faint rustle of her skirt blending with the muted creak of the floorboards. As they stepped into the garden, the air was thick with the scent of blooming hydrangeas and freshly turned soil. Magnolia House's gardens were a masterpiece of deliberate imperfection, with winding paths, vibrant flower beds, and ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. Clara's voice softened as she gestured to the overgrown patches and untamed vines. "This house isn't just about preservation," she said, her tone almost wistful. "It's about the stories it holds, memories of families, celebrations, and lives intertwined. Losing it would mean losing a piece of Charleston's soul." Her words resonated with Graham in a way he hadn't expected. He understood loss, the kind that hollowed you out, and left you searching for something to fill the void. For Clara, Magnolia House was more than a building. It was a living testament to resilience. "I'll do my best," he said quietly, his gaze sweeping over the garden. "This place deserves to be saved." She turned to him, her expression briefly unguarded before she nodded. "Let's see if you can handle the basics first." Hours later, as twilight descended and the cicadas began their evening symphony, Graham found himself back in his modest rented room above a small coffee shop. The room was spare, with a single bed, a worn desk, and a window overlooking the bustling street below. He lay on the creaky mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, his thoughts circling back to Clara. She was unlike anyone he had met in the gilded world he had left behind. Passionate, driven, and deeply connected to something greater than herself. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose, though it was tempered by the weight of his secret. Clara deserved honesty, but the truth would risk everything he was trying to build here. The soft hum of Charleston settled around him, the night cloaking the city in its quiet embrace. Graham closed his eyes, the faint scent of jasmine drifting through the open window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new risks. But for now, he let himself rest, the steady rhythm of the city lulling him into a dreamless sleep. The morning sunlight filtered through the gauzy curtains of Graham's rented room, casting golden streaks across the floorboards. He sat at the small desk, tying the laces of his sturdy work boots, a sense of purpose already stirring in his chest. Charleston was waking slowly outside, the faint clatter of shopkeepers opening their doors blending with the hum of traffic in the distance. Today marked his first full day at Magnolia House, and for the first time in years, Graham felt like he was stepping into something real. When he arrived at the estate, the house stood as regal as ever, its ivy-clad walls shimmering under the early light. The gardens stretched out before him, their untamed beauty a challenge he was eager to tackle. Clara Evans was already there, her auburn hair glinting in the sun as she studied a clipboard with meticulous focus. She looked up as he approached, her hazel eyes sharp but not unkind. "Good, you're here," Clara said, handing him a pair of gloves and gesturing toward the overgrown flower beds. "We'll start with the East Garden. It's the first thing guests see, and we need it to make an impression for the fundraiser this weekend." Graham nodded, slipping on the gloves. He followed her to the eastern side of the property, where vibrant azaleas and hydrangeas struggled to thrive amidst a tangle of weeds. Clara crouched near a patch of wilting daisy, her fingers deftly plucking away the invaders, choking their roots. "You've done this before," Clara said, glancing at him as he began to prune the hedges with surprising ease. "I grew up around gardens," Graham replied lightly, focusing on his task. "My mother had a fondness for them." Clara paused, her brow furrowing slightly as if trying to piece together more of his story, but she didn't press further. Instead, she offered a faint smile. "Well, that'll come in handy here. Magnolia House has plenty of work to keep us both busy." For hours, they worked side by side, the rhythmic snip of shears and the earthy scent of soil filling the air. Clara spoke sparingly, her focus on the task at hand. But Graham didn't mind. Her silence wasn't cold. It was purposeful, the kind that came from someone deeply invested in their work. He found it oddly grounding. As the sun climbed higher, the first beads of sweat began to gather on his brow. Clara stood, brushing dirt from her hands and motioned toward the shaded veranda. "We'll take a break. There's iced tea inside." The interior of Magnolia House was cooler, the faint aroma of polished wood mingling with the floral scent of fresh arrangements. They sat at a small table near the kitchen, glasses of tea sweating in the humid air. Clara leaned back in her chair, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "So, Grant," she began, her tone more conversational than before, "what brought you to Charleston?" Graham hesitated, careful to keep his answer vague. "I needed a change of pace. New York felt too much." Clara nodded, her expression unreadable. "I get that. Sometimes places like this," she gestured to the house around them, "remind us of what really matters." Before he could respond, a voice interrupted. "Clara, there you are!" A tall, dark-haired woman strode into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She exuded an air of effortless sophistication, her tailored linen dress impeccable despite the midday heat. Clara smiled, standing to greet her. "Good to see you, Miriam," Clara said warmly. "What brings you by?" Miriam Langston waved a hand, her diamond bracelet catching the light. I came to drop off the auction items for the fundraiser, and I wanted to make sure everything's on track. You know how these events can get chaos by the last minute. Her eyes flicked to Graham, curiosity sparking in her gaze. And who's this? This is Grant Hale, our new groundskeeper, Clara said, introducing him with a nod. Grant, this is Miriam Langston. She's one of Magnolia House's biggest supporters. Graham stood, extending a hand. Nice to meet you. Miriam's handshake was firm, her manicured nails glinting. Likewise, Magnolia House needs all the help it can get, especially now. The emphasis on now wasn't lost on Graham. As Miriam and Clara discussed the fundraiser, he picked up snippets of their conversation. Mounting financial pressures, local developers eyeing the property, and the ever-present threat of modernization encroaching on history. After Miriam left, Clara lingered by the door, her brow furrowed. Graham approached cautiously. Is everything okay? Clara sighed, crossing her arms. Miriam's right. The fundraiser this weekend isn't just about preserving Magnolia House. It's about proving to the community that this place matters. If we don't raise enough support, it won't just be weeds we're fighting. Her words carried a weight that settled heavily in the air. Graham leaned against the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the gardens outside. What can I do to help? Clara turned to him, her expression softening. Just keep doing what you're doing. This place thrives on people who care. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Graham threw himself into the work, his hands blistered and dirt-streaked by the time the sun dipped low. As he walked back to his rented room that evening, the streets of Charleston seemed quieter, their charm illuminated by the amber glow of gas lamps. Inside, he sank onto the edge of his bed, the weight of the day catching up to him. Yet despite the ache in his muscles, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fulfillment. Magnolia House wasn't just a job. It was a lifeline, a chance to build something meaningful. Outside, the cicadas droned their lullaby, their song carrying on the humid breeze. Graham closed his eyes, the image of Clara's determined expression lingering in his mind. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. The morning at Magnolia House dawned crisp and clear, the kind of Charleston day where the air felt heavy, but carried the sweet promise of jasmine. Graham, or Grant as he was known here, was already in the gardens, meticulously clearing debris from the eastern pass. Nathan Calloway, the estate's longtime volunteer and part-time groundskeeper, approached with his usual slow stride. You've got a good hand with those shears, Nathan remarked, his tone easy but appraising. He leaned against a rake, his weathered face creased in a knowing smile. Not many come here knowing the difference between a weed and a seedling. Grant gave a nonchalant shrug, carefully trimming the overgrown hedges. I've had practice, he replied, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. Nathan was sharp, and Graham couldn't afford to let his guard down. Nathan chuckled, his laugh deep and warm. I can see that. You remind me of someone, a man who knows what he's doing, but isn't keen on telling folks how he knows it. Graham hesitated, glancing up. And that's a bad thing? Not bad, Nathan said, his gaze distant as if recalling a memory. Just means you've got a story. We all do. The older man's words lingered as they continued working side by side. The silence filled only with the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. Inside Magnolia House, Clara was juggling a slew of responsibilities, her movements brisk and purposeful. Evelyn Hartwell, her right-hand woman, intercepted her near the library, a skeptical frown marring her usually composed expression. Clara, Evelyn began, keeping her voice low. Can we talk? Clara paused, shifting the stack of papers in her arms. What's on your mind? It's Grant, Evelyn said, her tone sharp. Something about him doesn't add up. Clara sighed, her patience already worn thin. Evelyn, we've been over this. He's been nothing but helpful since he started. Evelyn crossed her arms, her brows furrowing. I overheard him earlier. He was using terminology that doesn't match his background. He doesn't sound like someone who spent his life working with his hands. Clara met her gaze, her expression softening but remaining firm. I'll keep an eye on him, okay? But for now, let's focus on the fundraiser. We need this to go off without a hitch. Reluctantly, Evelyn nodded, though her suspicion didn't waver. Later that afternoon, Clara attended a meeting with potential donors in one of Magnolia House's stately sitting rooms. The group included Miriam Langston, a polished socialite known for her deep pockets and discerning nature. "Clara, darling," Miriam said, her voice as smooth as silk. "Your passion is admirable, but passion alone doesn't preserve history. Results do." Clara bristled but maintained her composure. "That's exactly why I need your support, Miriam. With your help, we can ensure Magnolia House remains a cornerstone of Charleston's heritage." Miriam tilted her head, considering. "I'll attend the fundraiser, but my continued support hinges on the turnout and presentation. Show me you can rally the community, and I'll stay on board." The meeting ended with a mix of encouragement and pressure, leaving Clara both hopeful and burdened. Back outside, Graham noticed Clara pacing near the rose garden, her frustration evident in her hurried steps. Setting down his tools, he approached cautiously. "Tough day?" he asked, his voice gentle. Clara sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "That's putting it mildly. Anything I can do to help?" She turned to him, her expression skeptical but touched by the offer. "You don't have to get involved." "Maybe I want to," Graham said simply. Clara studied him for a moment before relenting. "Fine. We need seating arranged, promotional flyers distributed downtown, and the garden prepped for the event. Think you can handle that?" "Consider it done," Graham said with a small smile, already mapping out the tasks in his head. Later that evening, after completing his chores, Graham wandered into a small bookstore nestled on a quiet Charleston street. The scent of aged paper and leather bindings filled the air as he browsed the shelves. His gaze fell on a worn, leather-bound book about the history of Magnolia House, its spine gilded with delicate lettering. "This would mean something to her," he murmured, taking the book to the counter. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, studied Graham curiously as he rang up the purchase. "You look familiar," the man said, his tone casual but probing. "Do I?" Graham replied, keeping his voice even. The shopkeeper nodded, tapping the book lightly. "I've seen your face in a magazine somewhere. Philanthropy section, maybe." Graham's heart skipped a beat, but he maintained his calm facade. "I must just have one of those faces." The shopkeeper chuckled but didn't press further, handing Graham the wrapped book. "Enjoy." Back at Magnolia House, Clara sat in her office, poring over old photographs and documents. Her fingers brushed against a faded picture of a young couple standing in the gardens. The woman's smile was radiant, her hand resting lightly on the man's arm. Something about the image stirred a sense of familiarity, though Clara couldn't place why. Setting the photo aside, she exhaled deeply, her mind swirling with thoughts of the fundraiser, the donors, and Grant. She couldn't deny that he was proving to be an asset, but a small voice in the back of her mind echoed Evelyn's concerns. As the clock struck midnight, the estate fell silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves outside. In his rented room, Graham opened the book he'd bought, running his fingers over the embossed cover. He thought of Clara and her unyielding determination, the way she carried the weight of Magnolia House on her shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt a pull towards something meaningful, a connection he couldn't ignore, even if it meant risking everything. The morning sun bathed Magnolia House in a soft, golden glow, its ivy-covered walls seemingly basking in the warmth. Clara stood on the front porch, clipboard in hand, watching as volunteers buzzed about the property. The fundraiser was less than a week away, and every detail mattered. Grant emerged from the side garden, his shirt slightly damp from the morning's humidity, carrying a bundle of wildflowers he'd picked for the centerpieces. "Good timing," Clara called, motioning him over. "I was just thinking we needed something fresh for the tables." Grant grinned, setting the flowers down. "Figured these might do the trick. They've got that rustic charm." Clara eyed him, a hint of admiration softening her expression. "You've got a knack for this. Have you ever planned an event like this before?" "Not exactly," he said, crouching to sort the flowers. "But I've been to my share of fancy parties. Guess I picked up a thing or two." His nonchalant answer only deepened Clara's intrigue. She knelt beside him, brushing her fingers over the petals. "Well, your instincts are spot on. Thank you, Grant. Really." As the morning stretched into afternoon, Clara and Grant worked side by side, finalizing the fundraiser's setup. Grant's suggestions surprised her. A historical reenactment featuring local actors, a scavenger hunt for children to learn about Magnolia House's past, and a silent auction with items donated by local artisans. His ideas were both creative and practical, easing Clara's stress bit by bit. That evening, the two found themselves alone in the estate's grand dining room, surrounded by stacks of donation forms and event schedules. The soft glow of a single table lamp cast warm light over their work. "You're quiet tonight," Grant observed, glancing up from his list. Clara hesitated, her pen hovering over the page. "Just thinking." "About?" She sighed, setting the pen down. "Everything. The fundraiser. The house. Sometimes it feels like no matter how much I pour into this place, it's never enough." Grant leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "You're carrying a lot, Clara, but from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're doing a damn good job." Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained clouded. "What if I fail? What if all this effort amounts to nothing?" "You won't," he said simply. She looked at him, her walls lowering just enough for vulnerability to shine through. "How can you be so sure?" "Because you care," he replied, "and people can see that. They'll follow your lead, even if you don't realize it yet." The sincerity in his voice left her momentarily speechless. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt a flicker of hope, small but steady. The next morning, Miriam Langston arrived unannounced, her polished heels clicking sharply against the stone steps. Clara greeted her at the door, her nerves well hidden behind a polite smile. "Miriam," she said warmly, "it's lovely to see you." Miriam's critical gaze swept over the property as she stepped inside. "I thought I'd take a little peek at the progress. After all, I need to know my money's being put to good use." Clara bristled inwardly, but maintained her composure. She led Miriam through the gardens and into the library, pointing out the work that had been done and the plans for the fundraiser. "Well," Miriam said finally, her tone measured, "you've made strides, but the true test will be the event itself. Let's hope you're ready." As Miriam departed, Clara exhaled deeply, her confidence shaken but intact. The day took a sharp turn when Tessa Landry arrived, her entrance as dramatic as the sleek black car she stepped out of. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, she strolled toward the house, her smile all charm and no sincerity. "Clara Evans," Tessa greeted, extending a hand. "I've heard so much about you." Clara shook her hand cautiously. "Tessa Landry, I didn't realize we'd be seeing you here." "Oh, I couldn't resist," Tessa said, her tone sweet but laced with condescension. "Preserving history is such a noble cause, don't you think?" Clara forced a smile, her instincts on high alert. "Of course, every effort counts." As Tessa meandered through the property, she left a trail of subtle but pointed comments, planting doubts among the staff and volunteers. When she spotted Grant in the garden, her demeanor shifted slightly, her smile sharpening. "Well, if it isn't Graham Rutherford," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear. Grant froze, his jaw tightening. "You must be mistaken," he said evenly, though his pulse quickened. "Oh, I don't think so," Tessa replied, her voice dripping with amusement. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Their exchange was brief, but the tension lingered long after Tessa walked away. Later that evening, Clara confronted Grant in the garden. "You seemed off earlier," she said, her tone gentle but probing. "Around Tessa." Grant hesitated, his thoughts racing. "It's nothing, just nerves about the fundraiser." Clara studied him, her brow furrowing. "If there's something you're not telling me—" "There's nothing," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I promise." Though unconvinced, Clara let the matter drop for now. As the stars dotted the night sky, Clara and Grant found themselves in the garden again, this time in a rare moment of quiet. "I don't trust her," Clara admitted, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Tessa, she's up to something." Grant nodded, his expression serious. "You're probably right, but whatever she's planning, we'll handle it." Her eyes softened as she looked at him. "You say that like you mean it." "I do," he said, his voice steady. Their conversation was interrupted by the faint sound of Tessa's laughter drifting from a distant corner of the property. Unbeknownst to them, she was on the phone, her tone light but calculating. "It's all falling into place," Tessa purred. "By the time I'm done, Magnolia House will be nothing more than a footnote in history." Magnolia House shimmered in the soft glow of hundreds of lanterns strung across the gardens, casting golden light on the historic estate. Guests in elegant evening wear milled about, sipping wine and admiring the antique displays set up along the gravel pathways. The air buzzed with a mix of excitement and curiosity, underpinned by the gentle strains of a live string quartet playing near the central fountain. Clara stood at the main entrance, greeting each guest with a poised smile that masked her internal turmoil. Her navy dress flowed gracefully as she welcomed Miriam Langston, who arrived with a small entourage of equally polished companions. "Miriam," Clara said warmly, extending her hand, "thank you so much for coming." Miriam accepted the handshake with an appraising glance at the surroundings. "The place looks lovely, Clara. You've outdone yourself." "Thank you. I hope you'll find tonight worthwhile." Miriam's lips quirked into a faint smile. "I'm sure I will. Shall we?" Clara nodded, leading Miriam inside. As they passed through the main hall, Clara discreetly wiped her damp palms on the folds of her dress. The pressure to impress was mounting, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. In the garden, Grant was in his element, guiding a group of guests through a series of historical exhibits. Nathan had spent hours earlier briefing him on Magnolia House's storied past, and Grant absorbed the information with surprising ease. "This collection of letters," Grant explained, gesturing to a glass case, "was written during the Civil War by a soldier stationed nearby. He wrote to his wife about the beauty of these gardens, which he described as his sanctuary amidst the chaos." The guests leaned in, captivated by his calm, authoritative delivery. "Fascinating," one woman murmured, glancing at Grant with admiration. As the tour moved on, Nathan gave him an approving nod. "Not bad, kid. You might just be a historian yet." Grant chuckled. "All thanks to your crash course, Nathan." Across the estate, Clara was addressing a minor crisis. A caterer had misplaced the hors d'oeuvres trays meant for the silent auction room. She was in the middle of sorting it out when a commotion near the auction area caught her attention. "Clara," Evelyn called, hurrying over. "One of the auction items is missing, a silver tea set from the late 1800s. Guests are starting to notice." Clara's heart sank. "How is that possible? It was just cataloged this afternoon." "No idea," Evelyn said, her tone clipped. "But if we don't find it soon, this will turn into a disaster." Clara turned to Grant, who had just entered. "Can you help us look? We need to find it before this becomes public." "On it," he said, already scanning the room for clues. While Clara and Evelyn discreetly calmed the guests, Grant slipped into the staff area. His sharp instincts told him the disappearance wasn't an accident. After a few minutes of searching, he found the tea set hidden in the back of a storage locker. He carefully retrieved it, his mind racing with the implications. Returning the tea set to Clara, he leaned in to whisper, "I found it in the staff locker. This wasn't a mistake, it was planted." Clara's eyes widened, but she managed to maintain her composure. "Thank you, Grant. I'll handle it from here." Nearby, Tessa Landry stood with a glass of champagne, her eyes locking with Grant's across the room. Her smile was razor sharp, a silent acknowledgement of her handiwork. Later, as the guests dispersed to other parts of the estate, Clara pulled Grant aside into the quieter corner of the garden. "Thank you for stepping in back there," she said, her voice sincere. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "It's nothing," he replied. "Just glad I could help." Clara's gaze softened. "It's not nothing. Tonight was already stressful, and then this, whoever did it wanted to see us fail." Grant hesitated, debating whether to share his suspicions about Tessa. Instead, he offered, "You're handling it all incredibly well. Most people would have crumbled under this kind of pressure." She let out a weary laugh. "Trust me, I've felt like crumbling more times than I can count. But Magnolia House deserves this fight." Grant admired her determination, a quiet respect growing in him. "And you're the right person for it, Clara. Don't doubt that." Their moment was interrupted by a donor approaching Clara with a proposition. The older man introduced himself as Alan Price and spoke with the polished confidence of a seasoned businessman. "Miss Evans," he began, "I have a suggestion that could alleviate some of your financial concerns." Clara tensed. "I'm listening." "What if you sold off a portion of the property, just the undeveloped land near the eastern border? It could fetch a significant sum, enough to fund the house's restoration, and then some. The proposal hit Clara like a cold wave. "Sell part of Magnolia House?" she repeated, her voice faint. Alan nodded. "It's a practical solution. The integrity of the house would remain intact, and you'd have the resources you need to secure its future." Clara forced a polite smile, her mind reeling. "Thank you for the suggestion, Mr. Price. I'll consider it." As Alan walked away, Grant approached cautiously. "That looked intense. You okay?" Clara exhaled, her frustration evident. "He wants me to sell part of the property. To him, it's just land. But to me, it's more than that," Grant finished, understanding. "It's the soul of this place." She nodded, her eyes reflecting her inner turmoil. "I can't do it, Grant. I just can't. But what if I don't have another choice?" "You'll figure it out," he said firmly. "Trust your instincts. They've gotten you this far." As the evening wore on, Tessa slipped into a secluded corner of the estate, her phone pressed to her ear. "He's resisting," she said, her voice low but sharp. "But don't worry. By the time I'm done, they won't have a choice but to give up that land." The sun cast a golden glow over Magnolia House as Clara stood at the edge of the garden, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The soft rustle of the oak trees and the chirping of birds were calming, but her mind churned with unease. The recent fundraiser, though successful on the surface, had left her feeling unsteady. Whispers of doubt lingered in the air, amplified by Alan Price's unsettling proposition and Tessa's thinly veiled threats. Inside the house, Clara walked through the main hall, her footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floor. Her eyes lingered on a painting of the estate from decades ago. She ran her fingers along the edge of the frame, recalling her own childhood summers spent here. The house had been a refuge then, a place where she could escape the cold rigidity of her father's expectations. Clara's father, Edward Evans, had always disapproved of her fascination with history and preservation, calling it a hobby, not a career. The memory of their last argument played vividly in her mind. "You're throwing away your future," he had said, his voice cold and distant. "No," Clara had retorted, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm choosing a future I believe in." That conversation had marked the beginning of their estrangement, a wound that never quite healed. Clara sighed, shaking off the memory. She had built a life here, poured everything she had into Magnolia House, and she wasn't about to let anyone, especially Tessa, tear it apart. Meanwhile, in the garden, Grant and Nathan worked side by side, pruning hedges and clearing pathways. Grant found the physical labor oddly soothing, a welcome distraction from the pressure of maintaining his fabricated identity. "You're a quick learner," Nathan remarked, his tone gruff but approving. "Good teacher," Grant replied with a faint smile. Nathan leaned against his rake, his weathered face thoughtful. "You know, this place has a way of bringing out the best in people, even those who don't think they belong." Grant hesitated, the words hitting closer to home than Nathan could have realized. "Do you ever feel like you're carrying the weight of someone else's expectations?" Nathan chuckled dryly. "Every day. But I learned a long time ago that the only expectations that matter are the ones you set for yourself." Before Grant could respond, Nathan added, "Funny thing, I was going through some old archives the other day and found something interesting. A photograph from a fundraiser back in the 80s. There was a woman in it, Eleanor Rutherford. Name ring a bell?" Grant stiffened but masked his reaction with a shrug. "Can't say it does. Why?" Nathan squinted at him. "Just curious. She looked like someone who cared deeply about this place. Thought there might be a story there." "Maybe there is," Grant said lightly, though his heart raced at the mention of his mother. Inside the house, Clara was meeting with Evelyn in the library, poring over plans for the next phase of restoration. Evelyn, ever the realist, pointed out the growing tension among donors. "I don't like it," Evelyn said, her voice low. "Tessa's been spreading rumors. People are starting to question whether you can handle this." Clara bristled. "Tessa can say whatever she wants. I know what I'm doing." "I know you do," Evelyn replied, her tone softer. "But perception matters. If we don't address this soon, it could spiral." Clara nodded, her jaw tightening. "We'll figure it out. We always do." Later that afternoon, Clara found Grant in the garden, organizing tools in the shed. She leaned against the doorway, watching him for a moment before speaking. "You've been busy," she said. Grant turned, wiping his hands on a cloth. Keeps me out of trouble. Clara smiled faintly but then hesitated, her expression turning serious. Can I ask you something? Of course, Grant said, though his chest tightened with apprehension. How do you stay so calm under pressure? It's like nothing rattles you. Grant chuckled, though it sounded forced. Years of practice, I guess. Why do you ask? Clara studied him, her hazel eyes searching. Sometimes I feel like I'm the only one barely holding it together. And then there's you, stepping in like you've done this 100 times before. Grant looked away, the weight of her words pressing against his carefully constructed facade. I'm just good at pretending, I guess. Clara's brow furrowed, but she didn't press further. Instead, she said, well, whatever it is, it's helping. So thank you. Grant nodded, relief washing over him as she turned to leave. But her words lingered, a reminder that his secret was a ticking time bomb. As the evening settled over Magnolia House, Tessa Landry sat in a dimly lit lounge, her phone pressed to her ear. The fundraiser was a setback, she admitted, swirling the wine in her glass. But I have another angle. Clara's leadership is already under scrutiny. All it takes is the right push to make her crumble. And the house? The voice on the other end asked. Tessa's lips curled into a smile. Once Clara's out of the picture, it'll be ours. The next day, Clara stood in the dining room, her hands resting on the edge of the heavy oak table. Scattered across its polished surface were spreadsheets, donation records, and a list of follow-ups from the fundraiser. The room, usually a haven of warm hospitality, felt cold and oppressive as Clara stared at the stark reality in front of her. The fundraiser had been a success on paper, yet its aftermath revealed the cracks in the foundation. Several donors had expressed reservations about continuing their support. Miriam Langston, in particular, had made her doubts crystal clear during their meeting the previous day. Your passion is admirable, Clara, Miriam had said, her tone dripping with polite condescension. But passion alone doesn't sustain something as significant as Magnolia House. Perhaps it's time to bring in more seasoned oversight. Clara replayed the words in her mind, each one an echo of the fears she had worked so hard to suppress. Could she really lead Magnolia House to its full potential? Or was she clinging to a dream that was slipping through her fingers? In the adjoining room, Grant worked silently, sorting through boxes of old records. He had offered to help Clara organize the backlog, hoping it might alleviate some of the mounting stress he saw in her. Yet even as he focused on the task at hand, his own worries loomed large. His carefully constructed persona was beginning to feel like a house of cards. Every interaction with Clara, Nathan, or Evelyn brought with it the risk of discovery. And now, with Tessa's schemes escalating, the weight of his secret threatened to crush him. Clara, Grant called, holding up a dusty folder. I think this has some of the donor information you were looking for. Clara approached, taking the folder from him with a small smile of thanks. You're a lifesaver, she said, though her voice lacked its usual warmth. As she flipped through the documents, Grant casually remarked, the Morris Foundation, they've been investing heavily in renewable energy lately, haven't they? Clara froze mid-page, her eyes narrowing slightly. How do you know that? Grant hesitated for a beat too long. Oh, I must have read it somewhere. You know, keeping up with current events. Her gaze lingered on him, a flicker of doubt passing through her hazel eyes. It wasn't the first time he'd made an offhand comment that seemed out of place for someone in his supposed position. Clara didn't press the matter, but as she returned to her work, the unease lingered. Meanwhile, in the archives below the main house, Nathan sifted through a stack of yellowed papers. The musty air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and faded ink, but Nathan hardly noticed. His focus was fixed on the ledger before him, its pages filled with meticulously handwritten entries. One name jumped out at him, Eleanor Rutherford. He traced his finger over the entry, which detailed a sizable donation to Magnolia House during a fundraiser in the 1980s. The timing matched the photograph he had found days earlier, showing Eleanor Rutherford at the estate. Rutherford? Nathan murmured to himself, the gears in his mind turning. Could Grant Hale be connected to the Rutherfords? The thought was absurd, yet the coincidences were piling up. For now, Nathan decided to keep his findings to himself. He needed more proof before confronting anyone, especially Clara. Upstairs, Tessa Landry's influence was already taking its toll. One of Magnolia House's most consistent donors had withdrawn their support, citing concerns about leadership stability. Clara was blindsided when the news reached her, the blow leaving her reeling. "What do you mean they're pulling out?" she demanded, clutching her phone tightly. "I'm sorry, Clara," the donor said, their voice detached. "I just think it's best to take a step back for now. Good luck." The line went dead, leaving Clara standing alone in her office, her heart pounding. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. It had Tessa's fingerprints all over it. That evening, Clara sought out Grant, her frustration bubbling to the surface. She found him in the garden, trimming the overgrown hydrangeas. "Grant," she called, her voice sharper than intended. He turned, surprised by the urgency in her tone. "What's wrong?" "I need to ask you something," Clara said, crossing her arms. "And I want an honest answer." Grant swallowed hard, the weight of her gaze bearing down on him. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "How do you know so much about everything?" Clara asked, her words measured but pointed. "You've been here, what, a few weeks? Yet you seem to know more about these donors, these businesses, than someone with your background should." Grant hesitated, his mind racing for a plausible explanation. I, "I've always been a quick study," he said finally, "and I've had a lot of different jobs before coming here. You pick things up." Clara didn't look convinced, but she sighed, letting her arms fall to her sides. "You've been helpful, Grant. I won't deny that. But I need to know I can trust you." "You can," Grant said earnestly, taking a step closer. "I'm here because I believe in what you're doing. Magnolia House deserves to thrive, and so do you." Her expression softened, but the doubt didn't fully leave her eyes. "I hope you're right," she said quietly before turning and walking away. As the night deepened, Nathan approached Evelyn in the library, the photograph and ledger in hand. "We need to talk," Nathan said, his voice low but firm. Evelyn glanced at the items he held, her brow furrowing. "What's this about?" "It's about Grant Hale," Nathan replied, "or whoever he really is." Nathan sat across from Evelyn in the Magnolia House library, the photograph and financial ledger spread out on the table between them. The air was heavy with unspoken questions as Nathan pointed to Eleanor Rutherford's name in the ledger. "She wasn't just a donor," Nathan said, his voice low but deliberate. "She was invested in this place. Look at the amount. No casual benefactor writes a check that big without a reason." Evelyn studied the photograph of Eleanor at an old Magnolia House fundraiser. The familiarity in her posture and the warmth in her smile felt oddly personal. "You're saying Grant is connected to her somehow?" "I'm not saying," Nathan replied, leaning back in his chair. "I'm showing you. Eleanor Rutherford, Graham Rutherford's mother, and Grant Hale? Too many coincidences for my liking." Evelyn's skepticism deepened, her fingers tapping the table. "We need to confront him. If he's lying about who he is, Clara deserves to know." By midday, Evelyn and Nathan found Grant in the garden, tending to the hydrangeas. The sun cast sharp shadows across the estate, heightening the tension as they approached. "Grant," Evelyn began, her tone sharp enough to cut through the buzzing cicadas. "We need to talk. Now." Grant straightened, his brows furrowing. "What's going on?" Nathan held up the photograph, his expression unreadable. "Care to explain why your mother's name is in Magnolia House's financial records? Or why she's in this photo?" Grant's eyes widened, his carefully constructed mask faltering. He stared at the photograph, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I can explain," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "But not here." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Then you'd better start explaining. Because if you've been lying to Clara—" "I have," Grant interrupted, meeting their eyes. "But not in the way you think." They moved to the study, where Grant stood by the window, his back to them as he gathered his thoughts. Turning to face them, he exhaled slowly. "My name isn't Grant Hale. It's Graham Rutherford." Nathan's expression softened, but Evelyn's gaze sharpened with distrust. "I came here because Magnolia House meant something to my mother," Graham continued. "She visited often when she was younger. It was one of the few places that made her feel at peace. After she passed, I found her journal. She wrote about wanting to preserve places like this, places that matter. I wanted to honor that." And you thought lying was the way to do that? Evelyn shot back, her tone bristling with anger. I didn't want my name to overshadow my intentions, Graham said, his voice firm but tinged with regret. I wanted to prove that I cared about this place, not because of my family or my wealth, but because it deserves to be preserved. Nathan nodded slowly, his skepticism giving way to understanding. You've shown nothing but commitment since you got here. I believe you mean well. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Maybe, but Clara needs to hear this from you. As Evelyn marched off to find Clara, Graham sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands. This is going to destroy everything, isn't it? Nathan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Truth has a way of shaking things up, but it's better than living with a lie. When Clara entered the study minutes later, her face was pale, her expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. Evelyn stood behind her, arms crossed like a silent guardian. Is it true? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you really Graham Rutherford? Graham stood, meeting her gaze with unflinching honesty. Yes, it's true. Clara's breath caught, her hands clenching at her sides. You lied to me. To everyone. Why? I didn't lie about what matters, Graham said, his tone pleading. Everything I've done here, every word, every action, it's all been real. The only thing I hid was my name. Your name isn't a small thing, Clara snapped, her voice rising. Do you know what's at stake here? Do you understand how much trust this place runs on? And you just waltzed in with your fake identity and thought that was okay? I didn't come here to hurt you, Graham said, his voice breaking slightly. I came here to find something real, to be someone real. Clara shook her head, her heart torn between anger and something she couldn't yet name. How can I believe anything you say now? Because I'm standing here, telling you everything, Graham said. Because I care about you, Clara, and I care about Magnolia House. The room fell silent, the tension almost unbearable. Finally, Clara turned away, her voice barely audible. I need time to think. As she left, Evelyn shot Graham a pointed look. You'd better hope she forgives you, for her sake and yours. Meanwhile, Tessa Landry was already working to exploit the chaos. At a chic downtown cafe, she sipped her espresso as Miriam Langston slid into the seat across from her. I hear things are unraveling at Magnolia House, Tessa said, her tone sweet but laced with malice. Miriam arched a brow. What's your angle, Tessa? Simple, Tessa replied, leaning forward. Clara Evans is in over her head, but with my resources and your influence, we can ensure Magnolia House becomes something truly remarkable. Miriam tapped her manicured nails against the table, considering Tessa's proposal. Back at Magnolia House, Clara retreated to her private office, her thoughts a tangled mess. She stared at the photograph Nathan had found, her fingers tracing the image of Eleanor Rutherford. For the first time, she saw Magnolia House not just as her responsibility, but as a thread in a much larger tapestry. The weight of that realization settled heavily on her shoulders as she gazed out the window at the moonlit gardens. Somewhere out there, Grant, was waiting. But could she ever trust him again? Clara sat in her office, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. Papers were strewn across her desk, financial statements, grant applications, and donor lists forming a chaotic mosaic of her desperation. She stared at the letter in her hand. Another rejection. The grant she had pinned her hopes on was denied, leaving Magnolia House teetering on the edge of financial collapse. She leaned back in her chair, memories flooding her mind. Her father's stern voice echoed in her ears. Dreams are a luxury, Clara. Practicality is what keeps the lights on. The same words he'd used when she first told him she wanted to study history instead of finance. She closed her eyes, pushing the memory away, but the hurt lingered. Grant, or rather Graham, was nowhere in her thoughts, or at least that's what she told herself. She hadn't spoken to him since his confession, avoiding him at every turn. When Nathan tried to mediate, she brushed him off, burying herself in work. Meanwhile, Grant was in the gardens, pruning the overgrown roses that lined the house's path. His hands moved methodically, but his mind raced. Nathan's words from the night before echoed in his ears. If you care about Clara in this place, you won't give up, Nathan had said, his voice steady. But you have to accept that proving yourself isn't about grand gestures. It's about persistence. Grant tightened his grip on the shears. He wasn't leaving. Not when Clara needed him, even if she refused to admit it. At the other end of Charleston, Tessa Landry was busy crafting her latest move. The private event she had organized at her family's estate was a masterpiece of charm and subtle manipulation. Miriam Langston stood at her side, sipping champagne as Tessa extolled the virtues of modern preservation. "Magnolia House is lovely," Tessa said, her tone oozing sincerity. "But Clara's vision lacks practicality. Imagine what could be accomplished with the right resources." Miriam arched a brow. "And by resources, you mean developers with deep pockets?" Tessa laughed lightly. "Exactly. A luxury resort wouldn't just preserve the history, it would elevate it, making it accessible to everyone. Isn't that the point of preservation?" Miriam swirled her champagne, considering. "Clara's dedication is admirable, but dedication doesn't pay the bills." Back at Magnolia House, Evelyn was pacing the parlor, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. When Clara entered, Evelyn stopped mid-step. "We need to talk," Evelyn said, her tone firm. "Miriam's wavering, and it's Tessa's doing. She's hosting private events, planting doubts about your leadership." Clara sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I can't control what Tessa does." "No, but you can fight back," Evelyn countered. "We can't let her win. Magnolia House deserves better." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Grant entering the room. Clara's body stiffened, but Evelyn's gaze softened. "I'll leave you two," Evelyn said, her voice quieter. "But think about what I said, Clara." When they were alone, Grant spoke first. "Clara, I know I've given you every reason to doubt me, but I'm not here to hurt you or this house. Let me help." Clara folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "Help how? By lying to more people?" "I'm done lying," Grant said firmly. "Tessa's not just trying to discredit you. She's working to turn Magnolia House into a resort. I heard her with Miriam. She's using every weakness she can find against you." Clara's eyes narrowed. "And you think I didn't already know that Tessa is a snake? What do you expect me to do, Grant? Trust you? After everything?" "No," Grant admitted. "I don't expect you to trust me, but I'll prove myself. Not with words, but with actions." Clara stared at him for a long moment before turning away. "Do whatever you want. Just stay out of my way." Grant left the room, his resolve hardening. If Clara wouldn't trust him, he'd find another way to protect Magnolia House. The next day, Clara faced another blow. A key donor, swayed by Tessa's promises, withdrew their pledge. The news hit like a hammer, leaving Clara questioning her every decision. She retreated to her office, the walls closing in as she fought back tears. Meanwhile, Grant dug deeper into Tessa's dealings. With Nathan's help, he began piecing together a pattern. Donors Tessa had approached, financial incentives she had offered, and subtle threats she had made. Late that evening, Grant caught Tessa on the phone in the garden. Hidden behind a hedge, he listened as she spoke to Miriam. "Clara's on the verge of collapse," Tessa said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Once she's out of the picture, Magnolia House will finally reach its full potential." Grant clenched his fists, the truth solidifying in his mind. Tessa wasn't just a rival, she was a threat that could destroy everything Clara had worked for. As the chapter closed, Grant stood in the moonlit garden, his determination sharper than ever. He would stop Tessa, no matter the cost. Grant sat in the dimly lit corner of a local cafe, his laptop glowing softly on the table. The hum of conversation around him faded into the background as he focused on the files displayed on the screen. Across from him, Michael Townsend, an old college friend turned private investigator, reviewed the documents with a practiced eye. "This is more than enough," Michael said, tapping the screen. "Falsified permits, kickbacks to local officials, and evidence of donor manipulation. Tessa's been busy." Grant nodded grimly. "We need to package this in a way that leaves no room for doubt. Clara deserves something airtight." Michael smirked. "Consider it done. Give me a day, and I'll have a full report ready for you." As Michael left, Grant leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. His double life had always been a gamble, but the stakes had never felt higher. If he could expose Tessa, perhaps he could begin to atone for the lies that had brought him here. At Magnolia House, Clara sat alone in her office, staring at a map of the property. Red ink circled a parcel of land near the back, a section donors had repeatedly suggested selling to developers. The money from such a sale would secure Magnolia House's future for years. Nathan and Evelyn entered, their faces etched with concern. "You're not seriously considering this, are you?" Nathan asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Clara looked up, her expression weary. "I don't know what choice I have. We're out of options." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Selling that land would undermine everything this house stands for. It's not just about the money, Clara. It's about preserving the legacy." Clara's voice trembled as she replied, "And what happens if we lose everything? What's the point of preserving a legacy if there's nothing left to preserve?" The room fell silent. Nathan placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "You'll figure this out. You always do." Later that evening, Grant returned to Magnolia House with a folder tucked under his arm. He found Clara in the garden, pacing beneath the glow of string lights. "Clara," he called softly. She stopped and turned, her expression guarded. "What is it?" Grant hesitated, then held out the folder. "I have something to show you. It's about Tessa." Clara accepted the folder, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. Her eyes widened as she read, the pieces falling into place. "This is," she began, her voice trailing off. "Proof," Grant finished. "Tessa's been manipulating donors, bribing officials, and falsifying documents to push her agenda. If you show this to Miriam and the others, they'll have no choice but to turn against her." Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "Why are you doing this, Grant? Why are you still here?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I believe in what you're trying to do. Magnolia House deserves better. You deserve better. If you want me to leave after this, I will. But I couldn't walk away without trying to make things right." Clara's walls began to crack, though she wasn't ready to admit it. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said quietly. "I don't expect you to," Grant replied, "but I'll prove it, one step at a time." The following morning, Clara and Evelyn met with Miriam Langston at a quiet cafe. Miriam's skeptical gaze softened as Clara laid the evidence on the table. "Tessa's been lying to all of us," Clara said firmly. "She doesn't care about preservation, only profit. Magnolia House deserves better than that." Miriam studied the documents, her lips pursed. After a long pause, she nodded. "You've convinced me. I'll speak out against her at the next community meeting." Back at Magnolia House, Grant felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. He was loading the truck with supplies when Nathan approached, a knowing smile on his face. "You did good, son," Nathan said. "Clara may not see it yet, but she will." Grant nodded, his resolve solidifying. "I'm not giving up on her or this place." But as the day turned to night, Tessa Landry received an anonymous tip about Grant's investigation. Sitting in her sleek downtown office, she clenched her jaw, her mind racing. "So, you think you can outmaneuver me, Graham?" she muttered, a wicked smile curling her lips. "Let's see how long that lasts." The town hall was packed to capacity, the low hum of murmurs buzzing like a hive. Every seat was taken, with residents spilling into the aisles and standing at the back. Clara stood near the podium, palms damp with nerves, her meticulously prepared presentation loaded onto the projector beside her. She glanced at Grant, who gave her a reassuring nod. Nathan and Evelyn hovered nearby, their supportive presence a calming anchor. In a corner of the room, Miriam Langston sat with an unreadable expression, while Tessa Landry, draped in an impeccably tailored suit, surveyed the crowd with a smug smile. "Ready?" Grant whispered. "As I'll ever be," Clara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The meeting began with formalities, the moderator addressing the agenda and welcoming the attendees. Clara waited for her turn to speak, her heart pounding as she clutched her notes. When her name was called, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and resolute, "Magnolia House has stood as a testament to our community's history and resilience for generations. Tonight, I want to talk not only about preserving its walls, but about protecting its soul." Clara's presentation unfolded with carefully curated visuals. Photographs of the house through the decades, testimonials from locals who shared their fondest memories, and plans for restoration that included educational programs and cultural events. She ended with a plea. Magnolia House belongs to all of us. It's more than a building. It's a beacon of who we are and where we've come from. I ask for your support, not just for the house, but for the legacy it represents. The room erupted into applause, though Clara noticed some skeptical faces among the crowd. She stepped back, glancing at Grant, who mouthed, "You nailed it." Next, Tessa rose with a calculated grace, her every move exuding confidence. Magnolia House is beautiful, yes, she began, her tone honeyed. But beauty cannot pay the bills. Progress demands hard choices, and I propose a vision for a brighter future. A luxury development that will honor the house's memory while providing significant economic benefits to our community. Her words were persuasive, bolstered by flashy renderings of high-end condominiums and restaurants. She peppered her speech with thinly veiled criticisms of Clara, painting her as naive and incapable. Under mismanagement, Tessa declared, Magnolia House will become a burden, not a blessing. The applause was polite but subdued. As Tessa returned to her seat, Grant stepped forward. His appearance at the podium was unexpected, drawing murmurs from the audience. "Forgive the interruption," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "But there's something you all deserve to know." He clicked a remote, playing a recording. Tessa's voice filled the room, sharp and unmistakable. "They're so desperate," she sneered in the recording. "Once Magnolia House is mine, I'll tear it down and put something worthwhile in its place. That's progress." Gasps rippled through the audience. Grant followed with a slideshow of documents, falsified permits, financial irregularities, and a list of officials she had bribed. "Tessa Landry's vision isn't for this community," Grant said, his gaze locking with Tessa's. "It's for herself. Magnolia House isn't a burden. It's an opportunity she plans to exploit at your expense." The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in shock and anger. Miriam Langston stood abruptly, silencing the crowd with a raised hand. "I was skeptical of Clara," she admitted, stepping toward the podium. "But I was wrong. She has proven her dedication and integrity time and again. Tessa, on the other hand," Miriam's voice hardened, "her actions are a disgrace. I stand with Clara and Magnolia House." Applause thundered through the room, the tide turning firmly in Clara's favor. Clara's eyes glistened as Miriam approached her, extending a hand. "I'm sorry I doubted you," Miriam said softly. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her gratitude genuine. Tessa, however, was far from defeated. She stormed out of the meeting, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Outside, she pulled out her phone, dialing a number. "They've turned against me," she hissed into the receiver. "It's time for Plan B." The line crackled as the voice on the other end responded. "Understood. Consider it done." The morning dawned with an ominous stillness, a heavy fog cloaking Magnolia House in muted gray light. Clara stood on the porch, staring out at the garden, her coffee untouched in her hands. The news had arrived late the previous night. A cease and desist order had been issued, halting all restoration work. Tessa Landry's fingerprints were all over it, and the implications were dire. Nathan approached from behind, his voice breaking the silence. "It's an emergency order, Clara. It's flimsy, but it's enough to freeze everything we've worked for." Clara nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "She's desperate, Nathan, but so are we." Inside the house, Grant was already at work, dialing contacts, drafting emails, and mobilizing allies. His focus was unshakable. When Clara entered, he looked up, his eyes reflecting both determination and concern. "We can fight this," he said, his voice steady. "We'll appeal to the council, rally the community. Tessa's playing dirty, but we have the truth on our side." Clara set her mug down and joined him at the table. "We don't have much time. If the grant is revoked because of this, it's over." The day was a whirlwind of activity. Clara and Grant split their efforts. Clara canvassed the community, gathering signatures and testimonials from residents who cherished Magnolia House, while Grant worked behind the scenes to secure legal support. Nathan and Evelyn managed the logistics, coordinating meetings and printing flyers. The rallying cry spread quickly. By afternoon, the town square was filled with people holding signs that read, save Magnolia House, and preserve our heritage. Clara stood at the center, speaking from the heart about the house's legacy and its importance to the community. As the crowd's cheers echoed through the streets, Tessa watched from a nearby car, her face a mask of cold determination. She dialed a number, her voice low and sharp. "Start the work now. Don't wait for approval." By evening, Clara received the call she'd been dreading. Tessa had hired a demolition crew, claiming it was for safety improvements. They were already en route. Clara and Grant raced to Magnolia House, their car skidding to a stop on the gravel drive. The sight of bulldozers and construction workers moving toward the historic structure sent a surge of panic through Clara. "Tessa!" Clara shouted, storming toward the scene. Tessa stepped out from the shadows, her calm facade infuriatingly intact. "You've lost, Clara," Tessa said smoothly. "This house is a relic. It's time for progress." "This isn't progress," Clara shot back, her voice shaking with anger. "This is greed. You don't care about the community or its history. You only care about yourself." Tessa's smile faltered, a flash of vulnerability breaking through. "Do you think I had a choice? People like me don't inherit legacies. We fight for scraps and build something from nothing. This is survival." Before Clara could respond, Grant stepped forward. "You've made your choices, Tessa, and now you'll face the consequences." He held up a document. "This is an injunction. You so much as scratch this house, and you'll be looking at years of legal battles." Tessa's composure cracked as the crew hesitated, unsure whether to proceed. Her desperation turned to fury, but she knew she was beaten. With a sharp glare, she signaled the crew to stop and stormed off, her defeat palpable. The tension lifted as the machinery fell silent. Clara leaned against the porch railing, tears of relief streaming down her face. The community gathered under the lantern-lit garden that night, their cheers and laughter filling the air. Miriam Langston raised a glass in Clara's honor, acknowledging her leadership and resilience. As the celebration wound down, Clara found Grant standing alone by the magnolia tree, the moonlight casting a soft glow over his face. She approached him, her steps tentative but resolute. "You stayed," she said quietly. "I couldn't leave," Grant replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "Not when there's still so much to fight for." They stood in silence for a moment before Clara spoke again. "I've been afraid of failure, of trusting someone, of losing this place. But you showed me that it's okay to lean on someone." Grant turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "You've given me something I didn't know I needed, a purpose. Magnolia House is yours, Clara, but I want to be part of its future. If you'll let me." Her answer was in the way she stepped closer, her hand finding his. Their kiss was a quiet affirmation, a promise of trust and partnership. The early morning sunlight filtered through the magnolia trees. Clara sat on a weathered bench, cradling a cup of tea. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers, and for the first time in weeks, the weight on her chest felt lighter. In her lap lay a letter, its words carefully written in neat cursive, each sentence infused with gratitude and hope. "Dear Clara, thank you for saving Magnolia House. It's more than a building. It's a piece of us, a reminder of where we come from and who we are. Your courage inspires us all. Please know you're not alone in this journey." Clara wiped a tear from her cheek, folding the letter carefully and placing it in her bag. It was these small acts of kindness from the community that reignited her resolve. She glanced up as Grant approached, a familiar book in his hands. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, offering it to her. It was a leather-bound journal, the cover worn but well-loved. Clara opened it hesitantly, her eyes scanning the delicate handwriting inside. "My mother's journal," Grant explained. "She wrote about this place, how it brought her peace when her life felt chaotic. I wanted you to know why Magnolia House means so much to me." Clara turned the pages, her heart swelling as she read Eleanor Rutherford's Reflections. There were sketches of the gardens, musings about the history of the house, and stories of quiet moments spent under the magnolia trees. "She sounds remarkable," Clara murmured. "She was," Grant said softly, "and she would have loved what you're doing here." Clara met his gaze, her expression softening. "Thank you for sharing this with me. It means more than you know." Meanwhile, the repercussions of Tessa's actions continued to unfold. Investigators delved into her fraudulent business dealings, uncovering a web of deceit that left no doubt about her motives. The town buzzed with rumors, but Clara remained resolute. When Tessa showed up at Magnolia House uninvited, her appearance was a shadow of her former self. "I didn't come here to beg," Tessa said, her voice brittle. "I just wanted you to know I thought I was doing the right thing. For me, for the town." Clara crossed her arms, her stance firm but not unkind. "You hurt a lot of people, Tessa, yourself included, but it's never too late to change." Tessa's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting away. "Maybe," she muttered before turning and walking away, her shoulders hunched in defeat. The focus shifted back to restoration as the community came together with renewed energy. Volunteers arrived in droves, armed with tools and determination. Children painted signs, families brought food for the workers, and even the skeptics seemed to rally around Magnolia House. A celebratory event was organized to mark the progress, and Clara was overwhelmed by the turnout. Tables were set up on the lawn, laden with baked goods and crafts donated by the townspeople. Local musicians played folk tunes, their melodies blending with the laughter and chatter of the crowd. During a quiet moment, Miriam Langston approached Clara, her demeanor warm and genuine. "You've done something remarkable here, Clara," Miriam said. "It's easy to write a check, but you've inspired people to believe in something bigger than themselves. That's no small feat." Clara smiled, her gratitude evident. "I couldn't have done it alone. The community made this happen." Later that evening, Clara and Grant retreated to the library, their favorite room in the house. The fire crackled in the hearth as they sat side by side on the sofa, discussing the future. "We should start a community outreach program," Grant suggested. "Workshops, historical tours, maybe even a scholarship fund tied to the house's legacy." Clara nodded, her eyes lighting up. "I love that idea. Magnolia House has always been about more than just the past. It's about building a future, too." Their conversation turned to more personal matters, their bond deepening with each shared word. "Clara," Grant said hesitantly, "I know I've made mistakes, but I want you to know that I'm here for the long haul, for Magnolia House, and for you." Clara placed her hand over his, her voice steady. "You've already proven that, Grant, and I think we're just getting started." As the firelight danced across their faces, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The wounds of the past were healing, and the future looked brighter than ever. The morning sun bathed Magnolia House in a golden glow, highlighting the freshly restored shutters and the vibrant magnolia blossoms that framed the entryway. The lawn buzzed with activity as volunteers and staff prepared for the grand reopening. Banners flapped gently in the breeze, and the faint sound of a string quartet warming up in the garden added an air of anticipation. Clara stood at the top of the steps, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. From the meticulous restoration of the original woodwork to the carefully curated exhibits inside, every detail spoke of the community's dedication and shared love for this historic landmark. Guests began to arrive, their faces alight with curiosity and excitement. Clara spotted familiar figures: Miriam Langston, now a steadfast ally, Evelyn Hartwell bustling around ensuring everything ran smoothly, and Nathan Calloway, beaming with pride. As the crowd gathered, Clara stepped up to the podium, the hush that fell over the attendees amplifying her nervousness. Taking a deep breath, she began. "Today we celebrate not just the reopening of Magnolia House, but the incredible journey it represents," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "This house has weathered storms, both literal and figurative. It has stood as a testament to resilience, unity, and the power of community. And thanks to all of you, it will continue to do so for generations to come." Applause erupted, and Clara stepped back, allowing others to take the stage. Grant approached her, his smile warm. "You were incredible," he said softly. "Thank you," she replied, her gaze lingering on him. "I couldn't have done this without you." The ceremony continued, with speeches from donors, local leaders, and even a few children who had participated in Magnolia House workshops. Each voice added to the chorus of hope and renewal that defined the day. Later, Grant made his own announcement. stepping up to the podium with an air of quiet confidence. "I've always believed in the importance of honoring the past while building a better future," he began. "That's why I'm establishing the Eleanor Rutherford Scholarship Fund, in my mother's name, to support local students pursuing studies in history and preservation. It's my way of giving back to the community that has embraced Magnolia House as its own." The audience erupted in applause, and Clara's eyes welled with tears. It was yet another reminder of how deeply Grant had committed himself to this journey and to her. As the event wound down, Clara found herself in the garden where the magnolias bloomed in full splendor. Grant joined her, holding something small and delicate in his hand. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. He knelt, revealing a ring nestled in a velvet box. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She would have loved you, Clara, and she'd be thrilled to know that Magnolia House brought us together. Clara Evans, will you marry me?" Clara's breath hitched, tears spilling freely as she nodded. "Yes, Grant. 1,000 times, yes." The applause that followed their embrace wasn't just in their hearts. It came from the Magnolia House team, who had gathered discreetly nearby, cheering them on. In the days that followed, Magnolia House became a hub of activity. Children attended workshops on local history, couples exchanged vows beneath the magnolia trees, and tourists marveled at the house's transformation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara and Grant stood hand in hand on the porch, watching the flickering lanterns light up the garden. "This is what it's all about," Clara said softly, "bringing people together, creating something meaningful." "It's just the beginning," Grant replied, "for Magnolia House and for us." In her quiet moments, Clara sat at her desk, penning a letter to her future self. "Dear Clara, remember this moment. Remember the people who believed in you, the lessons you learned, and the love that made it all possible. Magnolia House taught you resilience, trust, and the power of community. Never forget that the greatest legacies are built not just on history, but on the people who carry it forward." Her words mirrored those in Eleanor Rutherford's journal, a fitting homage to the woman whose vision had inspired so much. Folding the letter, Clara placed it in a drawer, a keepsake for years to come. As the night deepened, the house stood as a beacon, its light spilling into the surrounding darkness. Magnolia House had not only been restored, it had been reborn, a testament to love, perseverance, and the indomitable spirit of those who called it home. Magnolia House isn't just a story about love or heritage. It's a reminder that life's most meaningful connections often come from unexpected places. Clara and Grant's journey shows us the power of resilience, the courage to face the truth, and the strength that comes from trusting others. As the house was restored, so were the hearts of those who fought for it. What would you fight for if it meant preserving something priceless? Let us know in the comments below. And if you've been captivated by this story of drama, love, and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are more unforgettable tales waiting just around the corner. See you in the next chapter.